In 1991, a historian by the name of Herbert Illig came out with a theory, if you will, that the years 614 to 911 AD were completely fabricated. He called this the phantom time hypothesis. According to Illig, the Middle Ages never existed. Even that Charlemagne was a fictional character designed to create propaganda in favor of the Catholic Church. If this were true, then the current year wouldn't be 2024. It would, in fact, be 1724 right now. Okay, so this might seem like an outrageous claim when you first hear it, but wait until you hear why Illig came to this conclusion. The guy was onto something. So, how would anyone even manage to pull a whole 300 years out of their behinds in the first place? That's a damn big lie to pull off, and it would need an immense amount of support from just about every royal house in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and North Africa, if this was going to work at all. The invention of algebra came from the Middle East after all, and these guys understood the value of mathematics and all the numbers that came with it. The Egyptians were so anal about record keeping that their dates are accurate to the day, and the East Europeans especially were very devoted to keeping calendars of their royal marriages and reigns. They got to keep records of all that inbreeding and marriage treaties after all. Otherwise, they'd have disastrous lineages, like the Habsburgs, running around all over the place. Then there's the question of why. Why on earth would you even want to make up 300 years worth of history? The handful of records that we do have are almost solely based on documents that were written down by the church during Pope Otto's time in office. So what was so important that the Pope would want us to believe this level of deception? Well, let's take a look at what they say happened during those fictitious years before we get into why Illig thought that it was all fabricated. Hey, don't worry, we'll keep it to the highlights for this round to spare you the lecture. Christianity was starting to rise in Europe, and the Roman Empire was beginning to show signs of weakening. Rome had spread across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. They just had too many territories to manage, and their incredibly opulent way of living and their increasingly insane rulers didn't help their stability much. The Christians were being persecuted and were often thrown into the Colosseum to be devoured by wild animals for the public's entertainment. And then came the attacks from the Goths and the Huns, and they weakened the Roman Empire to such a degree that they'd never be able to recover from it. Long story short, this caused a domino effect where all of their previous territories regained their independence, and in time, the Catholic Church was erected in Rome. Now, Rome wasn't completely dismantled just yet, but it was a shell of its former glory and continued to lose its footing after this point. And the more territory they lost, the stronger the church became. The Middle Ages is often referred to as the Dark Ages, a time of disease, war, failing crops, and just so much death that you kind of have to wonder how there were even any Europeans left by the end of it. This is the time when the strange gap in history takes place that Illig noticed and based his hypothesis on. But the European royal houses began to spring up, despite the famines, and even the English were stepping out of their savage ways and into the upper class too. A lot of the time, you'll hear that the Dark Ages experienced a time of intellectual standstill, that no big strides were made. But that's not strictly true. Yes, most people were more focused on surviving than they were on philosophical issues. But something had to have taken place then, because at the dawn of the year 900, the royal houses were well established, and the structure of hierarchy was laid and set to remain intact for almost 1,000 years. But despite this enormous dispersion of power among ruling families, we somehow only got one king to thank for it: Charlemagne. According to that space, between 600 and 900, he was the one to finally overthrow the Roman Empire and to convert all of Europe to Christianity, leaving the religious rule split between two factions, the more powerful Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. But they were both Christian, and the Christian age rolled in with feared knights, monasteries that recorded every event, and places where higher learning could be pursued. Even prisons, strictly for royal prisoners, were set up, all funded and maintained by the church. By the end of the year 900, the church held all the information, records, and most of the muscle to enforce their might. Hey, if your tinfoil hat hasn't started vibrating yet, let us put this into perspective. With every royal house now indebted to the church, this gave the popes a great deal of political swing. No royal marriage, treaty, war, or newly installed chamber pot was handled solely by the leaders themselves. The church had a say in everything. Besides Joan of Arc and Charlemagne, almost nothing else but death and disease came out of this era. This is also when the decision was made to change the calendar. Before that, everyone just sort of used their own system to count the year by using the seasons, stars, or just some other form of arbitrary system that made sense to one culture in particular. Way back in the day, before the Dark Ages, Julius Caesar proposed the Julian calendar, based on the solar path that the Earth made around the Sun, so that the deferring time systems wouldn't cause as many headaches with trade and commerce as it did. He had the might to do it during the Roman Empire's heyday, and quite frankly, it made perfect sense. People had been using the Julian calendar for a century before the change was made. In 1582, the church decided to install the Gregorian calendar, the one we still use today, simply because the Pope at the time wanted Easter to land on March 21st, the spring equinox. This is suspicious on its own. The spring equinox is important to a lot of non-Christian cultures, so why change the date of a religion's holiday that actively believed that anything related to a religion outside of Christianity was straight up satanic? Pope Gregory argued that the Julian calendar was inaccurate with the solstices, and that the calendar became inaccurate by one day for every year that passed. After almost 1,500 years, it became 13 days out of sync. And he was right. By adding leap years, he got the calendar back in order, but not quite as accurately as he claimed it would. No matter how mathematically you calculate a calendar, it is impossible to get it completely right. The Earth isn't rotating at perfect pinpoint accuracy at all times as we'd like to believe. An earth-shattering event, like the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, was enough to set the Earth's rotation off. Comets flying past, a slight change in electromagnetic fields, you name it, and there will be a dozen more minor events that change our speed and trajectory as we zoom through space. No matter how Pope Gregory swung this axe, we'd be out by 2 weeks after every 1,000 years or so. So, why go to all that trouble just so you could have the exact same problem that the previous system had? At best, he bought a few hundred years before another reset, not all that earth-shattering in the grand scheme of things. After resetting the entire known world, do you really think a 300-year error would have been allowed to slip by unnoticed? That's what got Herbert Illig's spidey senses tingling in the 1990s. He started digging and he noticed that just before and after the savior of the church, Charlemagne's rule, things went a little too dark on the historical front. Or that those battles, notable figures, and claims couldn't be corroborated by any hard evidence, archaeological or otherwise. Illig believed that the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Constantine VII, and Pope Sylvester II conspired to move the calendar ahead in 610 AD. The 7th century was moved to the 10th century so that Pope Otto could rule in the new millennium, because that would look impressive. And after Otto, Pope Gregory took over, and all the popes in between were just made up to fit the narrative. Right as the year 610 came to an end, almost all records just disappeared. This was a time when Rome was still in the thick of things, and since no major loss of libraries or scholars was noted then, there's no reason that the Roman Empire would suddenly take a 300-year hiatus from their perfect record keeping. But Illig wasn't shooting high enough with his reasoning, in our opinion. The title of ruling in the new millennium wasn't a good enough reason for Otto to put this amount of enormous political pull just so it could look good on paper. So we'll get to the reasoning in a second, but first, let's look at all the other little tidbits that were piling up to lean toward a 300-year fabrication of events. The architecture in the 400s didn't change at all for 500 years. The first time we see any new innovations is in 900 AD. The official argument is that the Middle Ages' hard times halted any progress on the building front. But the reality is that if that were true, the exact opposite would be the case. In times as disease and war-ridden as the Dark Ages, castles and buildings should have taken a hit, going backwards in innovation, not standing still. Or at least that architecture would revert to utilitarian, cheaper, and more practical designs. Not only did architecture not change at all, but there are no traceable buildings that were constructed during 600 to 900 at all. No castles, no roads, not even a bathhouse. Just nothing. Only one single document, written by the church, documents the structures built during that time. There are several problems with this. Why would a single document be commissioned to record the whole of those 300 years? Every major building had its own records, filed independently before the time gap and after. But this sole record was apparently enough to encompass the construction of a little over 1,500 structures. Oh, and those 1,500 buildings, 97% of them don't exist anymore, or something was built over them. No archaeological traces remain of them to correlate to that one document at all. It's almost certain that this document was a fake, intentionally planted to spread false information. And it's also almost certain that it was commissioned by the church. Even the archaeologists who are infamous for disagreeing with any thoughts and theories that lie outside of mainstream archaeology have had to admit that there is no evidence of settlements or human remains during this time. No peasant or king was buried during the years 614 and 1911 that they've been able to conclusively link to that time period. Besides, are you telling us that for 500 years there were absolutely no innovations at all? A catastrophic event for humanity like the Ice Age didn't make us stand still. Hardship made us invent fire, clothes, complicated stitching, food preservation, catapulting us light years from where we'd been before the ice came. Humanity simply cannot stand still. Every other time in our history we go forward or we revert back to cavemen. There's no in-between, so why would this period be the exception? The only real notable figure to come out of these 300 years was Charlemagne. The man accomplished more than is humanly possible for 5 people to accomplish in a lifetime. Seriously, the guy has a resume that's comparable with the inhuman Roman gods. He reigned for 46 years, an already ridiculously long tenure at the time, without being wiped out by disease or war. And he sure fought and won a hell of a lot of wars. Apparently, he was an astronomer, an architect of buildings that don't exist anymore, innovations in agriculture. He created new laws. He restructured the entire education system, and he even translated the Bible. All while he was winning battles that reunited Europe left and right. No one in history comes even close to achieving the ridiculous amount of things that he was supposed to have done. Unless you believe Kim Jong-un and his outrageous claims. But we digress. The argument from the mainstream is that Charlemagne commissioned and signed off on these projects, that he was surrounded by brilliant people and they were in fact the ones who were written out of history. But that would contradict the idea that no innovations were happening during this time because of all the death and whatnot. So where are these notable people then? Well, there's definitely no records that were being kept, except a shining biography of a ruler who overhauled the world and no physical evidence to prove it. Now, Pope Otto needed to push this narrative, but to do that, he needed Asia, North Africa, and the Byzantines to corroborate the lie too. By this time, debt to the church was piling up, so he would have had the pull to make it happen. Maybe not so much in the Chinese Empire, but definitely enough to sway the rest. The same doctored records that have no archaeological evidence can be found in the Middle East, so they definitely played along. North Africa was a shell of their previous glory, so it wouldn't have been all that hard to push for the conspiracy there. And China? Well, the Asian empires have a long history of rewriting or completely erasing their opponents in previous dynasties. The year 900 to 1000 marked a great deal of change in the Chinese Empire, and if history has taught us anything, those new rulers would have jumped at the chance to insert their own narratives into the past to secure their rule. Ironic that all of those changes just happened to come after the reset. But back to Charlemagne. He definitely existed, but it's highly unlikely that he did everything he was said to have accomplished in a lifetime. He did, however, have a whole lot of children that royals today are still descended from. He just happened to be in power at the time, and he had enough sons and daughters to create an intricate little web of relatives to rule the new age. Pope Otto realized that the structure of rule was changing after the fall of the Roman Empire. The new religion was Christianity, specifically the Catholic Church. And if the church was going to rule over all of Europe and beyond, well, then it needed a hero to stand behind. Charles the Great, aka Charlemagne, just happened to be the next in line, and he brought with him a slew of kids that could be placed all over the world, further connecting Europe so intricately that the whole continent was essentially ruled by one bloodline. A bloodline that was tied to the church indefinitely, not to mention the huge amounts of debts that kings were willing to write off in exchange for an arranged marriage and their silence. Add a few saints and Joan of Arc to indoctrinate the already superstitious people into being completely reliant and trusting of the church, well, the Pope would be the true ruler at the end of the day. With his puppets wearing crowns, painting the picture of sovereignty in their given territories. With more than 90% of the known world living in poverty and unable to read or count past 20, well, it wouldn't have been that hard to deceive them. None of the peasants and common people even knew what a calendar was, let alone what year it was. All they cared about was surviving another day and keeping at least half of their teeth inside their skulls by the age of 30. That's if they even managed to reach their 30s, that is. Still, mainstream historians and archaeologists are keeping their teeth in the theory that the Dark Ages were so tough that it halted innovation, and that is the sole reason that those years are so lacking in infrastructure and notable figures. But this would have been the perfect way for the church to entwine itself deeper into every single facet of the world, the way to fund Vatican City and to stretch their might across the seas when new lands were discovered, placing them in the center of the known world. The phantom time hypothesis, the Great Reset, the erasure of 300 years, whatever you want to call it, it was just the start of world domination under the guise of the church, faith, and religion. And it's also the start on our new series on Vatican City, its past, its present, and its future. So stay tuned. This is going to be a long, bumpy ride full of all the things that conspiracies are made of. After all, every conspiracy is based on at least some grain of truth, is it not?